Alien princess mocked the human. If he wins, I'll be his wife forever. The princess said it with the same voice she used to order wine, and the moon court wrote it into stone before the laughter in the hall had finished. Back up, 72 hours. Before the wager, before the trial, before a human with his own grief in his pocket had any reason to know the shape of a Vayrani wedding cup. Daniel Cross sat by a shuttle window and watched Vera Prime turn under him. The city came up slowly out of the cloud line. Towers the color of old copper arranged in long spirals. Roads cut deep between them like the lines of a leaf. It did not look built. It looked grown. He had read the briefings, studied the architecture packets, spent 3 nights memorizing Vayrani protocol that would prove about as useful as a warm coat in a volcano. None of it had prepared him for how the light moved on those spires, or for the way the city's green canopy softened everything below it, as if the whole capital had been polished by centuries of patient hands. He had not planned to be on the shuttle. 3 weeks ago, the senior ambassador on the human delegation had collapsed at a state dinner in another system. Poisoned, though no one on the official record was saying that word yet. Daniel was the structural engineer attached to the embassy compound, there to certify that the new chancery would not settle into the bedrock under its own weight. He had been assigned the ambassador's chair because he happened to be the highest-ranking human in the sector still standing, not because anyone believed he belonged in it. The Vayrani receiving party met him at the pad. Tall, all of them. The shortest of the green-skinned escorts had a full head on him. Their skin tone ranged from a pale seafoam at the wrists to a deep emerald along the throats and jawlines. And Daniel had read enough xenobiology to know that color meant mood. Pale for calm, dark for contained. He watched their throats more than their faces. The Imperator's citadel rose at the heart of the capital like something left behind by a kinder species of god. 7-tiered. Domes of a metal Daniel did not recognize. Gardens cut into terraces 100 meters above the ground, where trees he had no name for moved in a wind he could not feel. He was escorted through it the way a stray dog is escorted through a library. Careful, measured, without affection. They walked him into the throne hall without ceremony. The Vayrani nobles stood in 2 long curves on either side of a stone floor, polished to a mirror. Conversation stopped when the human delegation entered, not suddenly, but the way wind dies before a storm. Daniel felt the room measuring him. Height, shoulders, hands, the age in his face, whether he was the kind of human that would break or the kind that would burn. The Imperator sat on a low seat at the far end of the hall. Not a throne, a chair. That alone told Daniel more about this court than any of the briefing files. An old man with skin gone pale green with years, scarred across the forehead and down one cheek, eyes the color of beaten gold. He rose when the humans approached, which no one in the hall seemed to expect, and he greeted them in accented Terran, so careful it had clearly been practiced. "You are welcome in my house," the old man said, and reached out a hand. He did not offer it the way a king offers a hand to a subject. He offered it the way a man offers a hand to another man. Daniel took it. The skin was warm, drier than a human's. The grip was firmer than he expected. The Imperator said a few words of courtesy. The senior Vayrani minister said a few more. Daniel said what the briefings told him to say and watched the gallery. He counted noble house sigils. He noted which nobles stood a half step forward and which a half step back. He was cataloging a room the way he cataloged a building, looking for the load-bearing walls and the weak points in the floor. And he did not notice the woman entering behind him until the entire hall went quiet again. She came in the way a knife enters a conversation. Daniel turned. She was tall. Even for a Vayrani, she was tall. Her skin was the darkest green he had seen in the city, deeper along her jaw and the hollow of her throat, a color so saturated it almost read as black in the low torchlight. Her hair had been shaved close on one side of her head, and the rest poured down her opposite shoulder in a single silver fall. She wore a formal robe the color of dried blood, cut at the shoulders to show the long, lean muscle of her arms. A circlet of dark metal sat on her brow, plainer than Daniel had expected a princess's crown to be. The eyes under it were pale gold, brighter than her father's, and they did not flinch from anything in the room. She looked at the Imperator. She looked at the human delegation. Her gaze moved through Daniel the way a searchlight moves through an empty warehouse, finding nothing worth lingering on, and kept going. Then it came back, not for interest, for inspection. "Father," she said. Her voice was low and clear. "Is this the new ambassador?" "This is Daniel Cross," the Imperator said, "of the human embassy." "Ah." She said it the way one says it when a servant brings the wrong wine. "The short-lived." A few of the younger nobles laughed. The older ones did not, which told Daniel something, though he did not yet have the pattern to know what. He stood where he stood. He did not smile. He did not answer. "I have met their kind before," she went on, for the benefit of the gallery more than for him. "Their bones break like reeds. Their decisions are made in a handful of breaths. Their treaties last an afternoon." She paused and her gold eyes settled on him again. "Their species will be gone before my portrait is dry on the wall." The silence that came after was the kind that has weight to it. Daniel understood, in that moment, that she was not performing for the court. She was performing for her father. Some old argument between them, being fought in a language Daniel had not yet learned, with Daniel's body as the surface, the words bounced off. He understood it, and he decided not to answer. The room wanted him to flinch. The cheapest gift he could give was not to. He held her gaze. He did not speak. He watched the green along her throat deepen. She read his silence as contempt. He could see her reading it that way, and he decided not to correct her, because there was nothing he could say in this hall that would not make the situation worse. The Imperator exhaled through his nose. It was a sound Daniel recognized. His own father had made that sound over a chessboard more than once, watching his daughter throw away a piece she did not need to lose. "Daughter," the Imperator said lightly, in a voice the gallery was meant to hear, "find a more worthy entertainment." And Kareth Violin, crown princess of the Vairani Imperium, smiled for the first time that night. It was not a kind smile. "I will," she said. She stepped into the center of the hall. This was the place in Vairani ceremony where formal speech was made, where oaths were sworn and rebukes handed down, and Daniel felt the room rearrange itself around her automatically. The nobles stopped whispering. The gallery leaned in. Whatever she was about to say, the hall had learned in advance to take it seriously. "I invoke the trial of 3, she said. The sentence landed like a dropped stone. An old nobleman in the second row sat forward and said something in the old tongue that Daniel did not catch, and the Imperator raised one hand to silence him, though his gold eyes had narrowed. "The last invocation," she continued slowly, in Terran so that Daniel would not miss a word, "was 211 years ago. The last invocation by a royal house was twice that. The ritual is on the books. The ritual is binding." She turned to look at Daniel. "I invoke it against the new ambassador of the human embassy." Daniel said nothing. He was still cataloging. "The terms," she went on, "will be simple, in the interest of a species that has difficulty with complexity." A few titters from the younger nobles. "If the human wins the trial of 3, I, Kareth Violin, daughter of the Imperator, will be his wife. Before the moon court. Sealed. Forever." The hall held its breath. The word forever hung there like a hammer at the top of its arc. Laughter broke first from the noble houses that had the most to gain from the princess's humiliation, and then from the younger courtiers who had no idea what the trial of 3 actually involved. The older nobles, the ones who had read the records, did not laugh. They looked at her the way men look at a fire that has spread past the point of being useful. Daniel stood very still and thought about the shape of the trap. He was not a diplomat. He was an engineer. Engineers are taught to look at a structure and find the stress concentrations, the points where a single hidden load will tear everything around it apart. This was one of those points. If he refused her challenge, the humans in the hall would read it as cowardice, the Vairani would read it as contempt for their oldest traditions, and the trade accord he had been sent to sign would be strangled before the ink touched it. If he accepted, she expected him to die. He raised his voice for the first time since entering the hall. "What happens," he said, "if I lose?" It was a small question. It cut through the laughter like a knife through cloth. "The court's chief magister, A gray-skinned old Virani in long silver robes stepped forward and read from a handheld slate. Exile for the human, he said. Withdrawal of the embassy for a generation. Collapse of the trade accord. The Virani Imperium would accept no further human delegations until the current imperator's grandchildren were old. He read the terms without inflection, the way a doctor might read the diagnosis of something terminal. Daniel looked at the princess. She was watching him the way a cat watches a bird that has realized the window is closed. "I accept," he said. He said it quietly, and he felt the hall tilt. Not everyone had expected him to. The princess had expected him to, but she had expected him to do it loudly, with a speech, with a human's blustering performance of courage. Instead, he had said it the way one agrees to a dental appointment, and he watched her green darken at the collarbones and knew he had scored a point in a game she did not yet realize they were playing. The moon court was summoned. It was not a place. It was a rite. 3 silver rings were lowered into a cup of dark ritual wine by 3 magisters in white robes, and the oath was read aloud in the old tongue and then in Terran, and Daniel had to step forward and sign his name in a language he had been studying for 3 weeks. He wrote the characters slowly. He had practiced them. He had not practiced them enough. Kareth watched him write, and her mouth did the thing that on a human face would have been a sneer, as if his slowness confirmed everything she had said about his species. Daniel did not correct her. He finished the last stroke, set the stylus down, and stepped back. Witnesses from 6 noble houses came forward to sign. The imperator signed last. His pen hesitated above the parchment for a heartbeat, which Daniel saw, and which the rest of the hall did not. Then the old man signed, and it was done, and the cup of wine was poured out onto the stone floor, and the stain of it spread slowly across the polished surface, like the shadow of something settling in for a long stay. The trial of 3 would begin at dawn, 2 days from that night. The hall emptied slowly. Nobles bowed to the imperator and withdrew. The human delegation withdrew with all the dignity they could muster, which was not much. The princess did not look at Daniel again. She walked out on the side of the hall opposite the one she had entered, and the court's gold light followed her. Daniel walked the outer gardens alone that night. The citadel's terraces stepped down into the city in long cascades of dark grass and moving water, and the air on the upper gardens was cool and smelled of something spiced that Daniel had no name for. He stopped at a low stone balustrade and looked out across the capital. The copper towers caught the last of the evening sun and held the color in them long after the sun was gone. And for a long moment Daniel stood there and did not think about the oath he had just signed at all. "Human," said a voice behind him in broken Terran. He turned. An old Virani servant stood at the edge of the garden, half in the shadow of a column, her skin pale with age and the simple gray of her uniform almost colorless in the low light. She held a cloth and a cleaning rod. She had been polishing the stonework. He had not heard her arrive. "No outworlder," she said quietly, "has ever survived the first trial." "All right," Daniel said. "No outworlder," she said, as if she had not heard him, "has ever triggered the third." "All right." She looked at him for a long moment. Her face was very still, the kind of stillness that comes from working in the presence of powerful people for 50 years and learning how to be invisible. Her name, he would learn later, was Hala. He would not forget it. "Good luck, human," she said. She went back to her cleaning, and Daniel walked back to his rooms and laid the metal token from his sister's orbital on the table beside the bed, and sat with it for a long time without sleeping. Dawn on the 3rd day came in the color of old bronze. They took him to the ordeal of flesh first. The arena was a circular pit of pale sand sunk into the floor of an old garrison on the eastern edge of the capital. Stone benches rose in tiers around it, packed with nobles and military officers. Daniel stood in the center of the pit in a dark wrap around his waist and nothing else, barefoot on the sand, and he felt the cold of the morning on the long muscle of his shoulders and listened to the hall fill up. The princess sat in the royal gallery above him. She wore a dark green robe that almost matched her skin and a circlet of plain metal on her brow, and her gold eyes did not leave his face from the moment he entered the arena. Vaith Kuran walked in through the opposite gate. He was a Virani champion of the old kind, a full head taller than any man Daniel had ever met, and twice as broad across the chest, with a body built for the one thing it had been trained to do. His skin was a deep, mossy green, streaked with old scar tissue silver across the ribs. He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who had beaten every opponent he had been asked to beat. He nodded to Daniel with a courtesy that was almost friendly. It was a courtesy that said, "I do not want to kill you, and I will not kill you, but I will hurt you until you ask me to stop." The Magister rang a small bell. The fight was not a fight. Daniel knew that in the first exchange. He had trained in combat, as every human engineer in deep space postings did. But he had trained in how to get out of a fight, not how to win one. Quran was not a man he could strike. Quran was a wall he could hit himself against until one of them broke. And Quran was not going to be the one who broke. So Daniel did not try to hit. He closed. He let himself be caught. He let himself be thrown. He felt the sand hit him across the length of his back the first time and heard the crowd exhale. He got up. He closed again. He was thrown again, harder, into the wall of the pit, and he felt the rib in his left side go crooked against the stone. He got up. He closed again. By the fifth fall, the arena had gone quiet. By the eighth, the Vayrani champion had stopped smiling. By the 10th, Quran stepped back from him and looked up at the Magister, and Daniel heard the big man say, low and steady in his own tongue, words that the translator on Daniel's cuff rendered as, "End this." The Magister looked at the princess. The princess did not move. Daniel spoke through blood on his teeth. "Ring the bell," he said, "when the bell is supposed to ring." Quran looked at him for a long moment. Then the big champion stepped forward and threw him again, but gentler this time, almost apologetic, a throw that did not break anything further. Daniel got up. The bell rang. The crowd did not cheer. The crowd sat in the silence you get when something has happened that was not in the schedule. The Magister raised a hand. "The human endures," he said. "The ordeal is complete." Daniel bowed as the ritual required and walked out of the arena on his own feet. He was carrying his weight badly on one side, and every breath moved the bad rib. But he walked. He did not look at the royal gallery. He did not need to. He could feel the princess watching him. Her green had gone paler along the throat for the first time that morning. They gave him 6 hours. He spent them in a medical ward with his side bound, and when they came for him at the second bell, he was on his feet. He refused the painkiller. He could not afford to be slow. The ordeal of mine was in the oldest part of the citadel. They called it the Labyrinth of Violin, though it had been built by an architect whose name nobody remembered and whose house had fallen out of the records 3 centuries before the Violins took the throne. It was a network of ritual halls threaded through the lower levels of the citadel, chambers that opened into chambers, corridors that turned back on themselves, doorways cut into the stone in places that did not make architectural sense. No record existed of a complete map. Every candidate who had ever taken the ordeal had come out with a different sequence. The Magister led Daniel to the entry, an arched doorway, a single lit sconce beside it, the flame green, the light thin. "You will be observed," the Magister said. "You will not be helped. The ordeal ends when you find the sealed room. The average completion is 11 hours. The record is 6. Daniel stepped through the arch. The first thing he did inside the labyrinth was stop walking. He stood in the first corridor and closed his eyes and listened. Most candidates, he understood, treated the ordeal as a visual problem. They walked the halls and memorized turns. They mapped what they could see. That was the trap. A labyrinth built by people who understood resonance would never be solved by eyes. The Vayrani had built this place on harmonics that only a structural engineer would feel, and Daniel was a structural engineer before he was anything else, and he had been reading load paths through old buildings since he was 16 years old. He felt the airflow first. He felt it through the loose cuff of his sleeve, a current moving from his left to his right, warmer than the air in the corridor, which meant it came from a larger chamber somewhere deeper in. He followed the current. When it forked, he placed his palm against the stone wall and felt for the low vibration of movement in the structure, the hum of the air settling, and he followed that. 3 hours in, he found a doorway that had been plastered over. 4 hours in, he found a door no Vayrani had used in a century, cut into the floor, covered by a loose stone that rocked under his weight. 5 hours in, he was in the sealed room. It was a small square chamber, stone on all 6 sides, with a single lit lamp at the center and a ledger on a wooden stand beside it. The ledger was open. Daniel stepped forward and looked down at the page. His name was written there. Not in the old Vairani script, in his own Terran characters, in his own handwriting. He knew his own handwriting. He had signed his name in that exact shape 2 nights earlier in the throne hall. He stood with his hand on the stand for a long time. The Vairani had a legend, he would learn later, that the labyrinth wrote the names of its true winners into the stone before they arrived. He did not believe the legend, but he looked at the ledger, and he looked at his name, and he thought about the other explanations and decided to put them away for another time. The Magisters came for him. He had completed the ordeal in just under 5 hours, half the expected time. A new record. In the royal gallery, while he had been in the labyrinth, the princess had watched the hollow screens in silence for 4 hours and 40 minutes. She had not smiled once. Her father had noticed. Her father had said nothing. The ordeal of heart was at sunset. This was the ordeal the Vairani did not speak about in daylight. They led Daniel into a dark chamber at the base of the citadel, a place where the stonework was older than the rest of the building, and they gave him a single lit torch and pointed him toward a door at the far end of a long room. Beyond that door, they told him, was the victory chamber. He needed only to cross the room and open the door, and the ordeal was complete. The door stood 50 meters away. Halfway across the room, against the left wall, a woman was bound to a panel of dark metal with her arms up over her head. She was bleeding from a wound along her hairline. Her mouth was gagged. Her eyes were open and wide, and they found Daniel's the moment he entered. The panel she was bound to was wired into a great mechanical engine set into the ceiling above, and Daniel, standing in the doorway with his torch, saw immediately what he was looking at. The panel was the ordeal's fail point. If he took the direct path to the victory door, the engine would complete its cycle in the next minute, and the panel would close, and the woman bound to it would be crushed between the mechanism and the stone. He could see it. He could hear the engine cycling toward its close. He could see the victory door 50 meters away, and he could see that he would get there in time to win. Daniel did not pause. He did not weigh it. He turned toward the woman in the wall, and he ran to her, and he did not look back at the victory door once. He broke the brackets on the panel with his bare hands and the metal token from his pocket, the piece of orbital hull that had been in his sister's jacket when she died. The brackets were old and the metal was softer than it looked, and the token was harder than any of it. He pried her arms free. The engine above him seized, ground, shuddered. He heard the path to the victory door slam shut behind him. He had failed. He pulled the gag out of her mouth and looked at her face, and saw in the low torchlight that she was not bleeding. The blood was paint. The wound was theatrical. Her eyes were full of tears, but the tears were gratitude, not pain. The ceiling opened. Not a sound of a trap, a sound of ritual. The stone parted in a long seam, and light came through from the chambers above, and the chief magister's voice came down to him from the ritual gallery, amplified by the structure. The mercy gate, the magister said, is the third ordeal. Victory through victory is only victory. Victory through mercy is the full measure of the house. The woman in the wall was a hologram. Her suffering had been constructed. The test had been real. A net of monitors in the stone had read his heart, his breath, the tension in the muscle of his shoulders, the absence of calculation in his face when he turned from the victory door and ran to her. He had been scored not on the outcome, but on the choice, and on the speed of the choice, and on the complete absence of hesitation in the speed of it. The magister's voice continued. 3 names, he said. 3 names in the ordeal's full record. A Vairani saint from the waste period, a young heir 3 centuries ago, a hermit in the last era. None of them outworlders. Ever. The hologram faded. Daniel stood in the chamber with the metal token in his hand and the torch beside him. And in the gallery above, he heard the silence that means that a room full of Vairani nobles does not know what to say. Kareth Valen walked into the chamber alone. Her green had gone paler than he had seen it. It was almost the color of river stone at her temples. She stopped 5 meters from him, and she looked at him with an expression he had no vocabulary for. Did you know, she said quietly in the old tongue, did you know it was the gate? Daniel answered in Terran, his own language, the only one he had. No, he said, I just could not leave her. The court reacted in stages. The first reaction was silence, a long, uncomfortable silence in which 600 Vayrani nobles were asked to rearrange everything they knew about an entire species in the span of a few breaths. The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt longer. The second reaction was the imperator. The old man rose from his chair in the royal gallery, walked down the long stone steps to the floor of the chamber where Daniel still stood, and embraced him, in full view of the court, without ceremony. The imperator of the Vayrani Imperium, who had embraced no outworlder in his 40 years on the chair, put his arms around Daniel Cross and held him briefly, and when he stepped back, he placed his right hand flat against Daniel's chest, over the heart, and held it there. My son, the old man said. He said it in the old tongue, and then he said it in Terran so there would be no misunderstanding. My son. Some nobles bowed, others stared. Two men near the back of the gallery, the head of the house of Tesser and the head of the house of Ion, stood without moving and did not bow and did not stare. They watched. They filed the moment away. Daniel, even in the fog of exhaustion, noticed them. He would remember them. Kareth stood apart through all of it. Her father had not looked at her. The court had not looked at her. She had gone as pale as Daniel had ever seen her. The green drained out of her temples and collarbones so completely that her skin had taken on a translucent quality, like water held up to the light. She said nothing. She did not move. She simply stood there and absorbed the reversal of her own life in public, and Daniel, even as the imperator's hand was on his chest, could not stop being aware of her. They led him to the robing room. It was a small chamber at the eastern end of the citadel, lined with cedar and full of the ceremonial garments the court wore for state functions. 3 servants were already laying out a wedding robe for him. Vayrani wedding robes were not sized for human frames. They were doing their best. One of them, Hala, the old servant from the gardens, stood quietly in the corner and did not speak but met his eyes once when he entered, and held his gaze for the length of a long breath. Kareth came in behind the servants. She waved them out. Hala lingered at the door until Kareth turned and looked at her. Then Hala bowed and stepped out. The door closed behind her. Kareth and Daniel stood alone in the cedar-paneled room. She looked at him for a moment, and he could see her gathering herself, and then she said what she had come to say. I will give you 3 estates on the coast, she said. Her voice was low and very steady. I will give you gold equivalent to the annual tribute of the southern continent. I will give you 3 ships of the fleet and the crews to run them. I will give you anything within my power to give. I am asking you to release me from the oath. Daniel said nothing for a while. He was looking at the robe on the chair. When he spoke, he did not speak about the bribe. Would you release me, he said, if it had gone the other way? He watched her face. He watched the answer start to form. He watched the answer die. Her green darkened again along the collarbones. She looked at the wall. No, she said. I did not think so. He turned and faced her. He was tired. His ribs hurt. His left eye was swelling shut from the 3rd fall in the flesh ordeal, and he had not slept more than 2 hours in 3 days. And he said what he said quietly because quiet was all he had left. I will not hold you to anything you do not choose, he said. But the oath is public. The Moon Court witnessed it. The hall heard you say forever. We are going to have to go through with the ceremony. After that, what's between us, inside whatever room we're in together, is yours to decide. I will not press you. I will not touch you. I will not ask you for anything you do not offer. She was quiet. But the ceremony happens, he said. I have a delegation to protect. You have a court to lead. Both of those things need the ceremony to happen. The rest is yours. She looked at him then. For the first time since she had walked into the throne hall 3 nights before, she looked at him without contempt. She did not speak. She nodded once, the shortest possible nod, and she turned and walked out of the room. The wedding happened at dawn. It was the strangest ceremony Daniel had ever attended, and he was the groom. Vayrani weddings did not have kisses. They did not have rings. They had silver ribbons, braided through the bride's hair by her mother's closest surviving female relative, which for Kareth meant her aunt, a stern woman from the Valen family's eastern branch. They had a single cup of dark wine, poured at the altar, shared between bride and groom without drinking, set down untouched at the end. They had the recitation of an old oath in the ancient tongue, which Daniel did not understand, but which he answered in the right place because he had been coached for the last 20 minutes by a very patient magister. In the front row of witnesses, an old noblewoman from the Moon Court watched Daniel with a steady, measuring gaze. She was perhaps 90, perhaps older, with skin gone almost white with age, and eyes that had watched 3 imperators sit on the low chair in the throne hall. When the ceremony ended, she nodded once to herself. Nobody but Daniel noticed. He did not know her name yet. He would learn it. The wedding feast followed in the great hall. Daniel sat at the high table in a robe that did not fit and ate food he had not tasted before, and nobles came by in a steady line to test him with loaded questions about human politics, human biology, human endurance. He answered them all plainly. He did not elaborate. He did not perform. After the 5th noble had walked away visibly unsatisfied, Kareth, sitting beside him, spoke for the first time since the ceremony had ended. "You are not entertaining them," she said. "No. They wanted a performance. I know. They will say things about you. They are welcome to." She looked at him sidelong. She took a sip from her own cup. She said nothing else through the rest of the feast, but twice he felt her green-gold eyes on him from the side, and he did not turn to meet them. The bedchamber was as big as a small hangar. It was a ceremonial space more than a private one, with a canopied bed in the center large enough for 5 adults, and tall windows looking out over the eastern gardens. Servants had laid out wine, fruit, a set of ritual oils. Kareth stood in the doorway when they entered and did not cross the threshold. "You will sleep elsewhere," she said. "All right." He took a pillow and a blanket from the bed, and he walked out of the chamber and down the hall, and he found an unused study 3 doors down. He lay down on the floor next to the cold hearth, with his robe still on because he had not been given a change of clothes, and he slept for the first time in 3 days. In the bedchamber, Kareth sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She did not undress. She did not sleep. She sat and she thought. Outside the windows, the eastern gardens began to turn green with the first light of morning. Dawn. She got up before the servants came. She walked the corridor until she found the unused study, and she stood in the open doorway and looked at the human wrapped in a blanket on the cold stone floor. He was awake. He looked up at her. He did not sit up. He did not pretend he had been anywhere else. "The kitchens are up," he said. "I could use a cup of water." She looked at him for a long moment. She did not answer. She turned and walked away. He got up and went to the kitchens anyway. He found the head cook there, a stout Virani man of middle years, and they drank water together, and the cook told him how the imperial bread ovens vented their heat, because Daniel had asked. The cook talked for 20 minutes. Daniel listened. He did not perform interest. He was interested. When Kareth walked past the open kitchen door an hour later, she saw him at the table, listening, with his head tilted the way he had tilted it in the labyrinth when he was listening for airflow. He was not performing for anyone. He was not performing for her. She stood in the doorway for a moment that the cook did not see, and then she walked on. The Imperator summoned them both before noon. The Imperator had news from Tessar Prime. Tessar Prime was an outer colony 3 weeks' travel from the capital, a mining world with a population of 800,000 Vayrani settlers sitting on deposits of a rare earth metal the Imperium needed. The local governor had been reporting low-grade civil unrest for a year. In the last month, the unrest had intensified. The latest dispatches said rebellion. The dispatches were vague in the way dispatches get vague when a governor is trying to control the narrative of events that have gotten away from him. The Imperator wanted Kareth at the negotiations. She was his heir, and she had been trained for this kind of work. He also wanted Daniel at her side. "Officially," the Imperator said, "as the human ambassador, here to observe." "Unofficially?" Kareth asked. Her father looked at his daughter for a long moment. "Unofficially," he said, "because I trust him." Kareth did not answer. The cruiser Theodora left the capital 3 mornings later. It was a ship of the old Imperial line, 400 meters stem to stern, crewed by 200 and change. Kareth took the royal suite on the command deck. Daniel was assigned quarters 2 levels down, in the officer's wing, which told him more about his real status aboard the ship than any diplomatic briefing could have. He did not complain. He unpacked his one bag and went looking for the engineering deck, because a man who does not know the shape of a ship he is aboard is a man who can be surprised. He found the engineering deck short-handed. There had been, he gathered in 10 minutes of observation, a quiet shuffle in the weeks before departure. 2 of the senior engineers had been reassigned. The chief engineer was competent, but she was carrying a watch that should have been split between 3 people. Daniel stood by the coolant manifold in the aft section and watched a junior crewman trying to trace a slow leak. And after a while, he stepped forward and pointed, without speaking, at the fitting the crewman had been looking right past for 10 minutes. The crewman stared at the fitting, then at Daniel. Then he tightened the fitting. The leak stopped. Daniel went back to his quarters. He did not mention it. 3 evenings later, at a formal dinner in the officers' mess, the chief engineer brought up the repair log. She had been reviewing it, she said, and the aft coolant leak had been logged under the name of the human ambassador. She looked down the table to where Daniel was sitting, well below the salt, and she raised her glass to him. Kareth, at the head of the table, looked at Daniel as if she had not seen him before. She said nothing, but that evening after the meal, she walked back to her quarters by a longer route that took her past the engineering deck. She did not go in. She stopped at the observation window that looked down on the main coolant array, and she watched the crew at work for a while. She was not entirely sure what she had been looking at when she turned and walked on. The days of the voyage began to accumulate weight. Small moments. Daniel at breakfast, passing her a cup of tea without looking up from his tablet, her taking it without comment. A young officer, newly promoted, speaking too sharply at Daniel across a conference table about what he called human protocol arrogance. Kareth, before she thought about it, silenced the officer with a single low word in the old tongue. The officer blanched. The rest of the table noticed. Kareth, afterward, sat alone in her cabin for an hour and was furious with herself without being able to explain why. The crew started to notice her noticing him. Rumors moved through a ship the way water moves through a hull. Within a week, half the crew of the Theodora had revised their opinion of the new human ambassador. Within 2 weeks, even the officers who had privately thought the marriage was an absurdity had started greeting him in the corridors the way they greeted officers. He was still sleeping in quarters 2 levels down from Kareth. That had not changed. What had changed was that nobody aboard the ship was still entirely sure that it should. On the 9th night of the voyage, Kareth could not sleep. She walked the upper galleries of the ship alone, the way she had walked palace corridors at night since she was a child, and she ended up in the observation deck on the prow. It was a long, narrow chamber with a single curved window that filled the front of the ship. The stars moved across it slowly. The only light in the chamber came from the stars themselves and from a single low lamp on a reading desk. Daniel was already there. He sat at the reading desk with a handheld slate in front of him, working through something. His shoulders were set in a way she had started to recognize. He was working on a calculation, not reading. He looked up when she entered. He did not stand. "I can leave," he said. "No." She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked the length of the observation deck and sat down in the chair opposite his. Not close, not distant. She watched the stars through the curved window for a while, and he let her. "Why did you do it?" she said finally. He did not ask what she meant. "I could not leave her," he said. "You knew the path to victory closed." "Yes." "You walked away from it." "Yes." She looked at him. She was quiet for a long time. "My father," she said, "told me once that the measure of a person is what they do when no one is scoring. I did not understand him for a long time. I did not understand him until I watched you in that chamber." Daniel said nothing. He set the slate down on the reading desk. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at the stars through the window. "I had a sister," he said quietly. "Her name was Anya. She worked on an orbital above a colony called Westering. 12 years ago, the orbital caught fire. There were 300 people aboard. She could have taken a shuttle off with the first evacuation. She did not. She stayed and she went back into the fire, and she pulled 2 children out of a maintenance bay. She did not make the second trip. He was quiet for a moment. "The piece of metal I carry," he said. "The one I used on the brackets in the third ordeal. That's from the hull of her orbital. I picked it up off the ground at the crash site. It's been in my pocket for 12 years. Kareth was looking at him. "My wife died 18 months ago," he said. "Her name was Mira. Not on a ship, in a hospital. It was a slow disease. I watched it take her. Nobody on the delegation knows. I have not told anyone since I boarded the shuttle to Vera Prime. I am telling you now because you asked me why I did it. I did it because I could not watch another woman die in a room while I walked away." He did not look at her. Kareth did not speak for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was lower. It was not the voice of the princess in the throne hall. It was not the voice of the woman who had bribed him in the cedar-paneled room. It was her own voice, which Daniel had not heard before. "My mother," she said, "was Vesa Valen. She was the Imperator's wife, and my mother, and the person I trusted most in the world. She died on a colony called Koran 7 10 years ago. There was a rebellion. She was there as a negotiator. The rebels took the negotiating chamber and killed everyone in it. She was 51. My father has not been the same man since. I was 15. She looked at her hands. "I have spent 10 years, she said, watching my father try to open the Imperium to other species, watching him fail, watching his own court resist him, watching the old houses wait for him to die. I have spent 10 years being the daughter of a soft imperator who can no longer hold his court in line. I was angry the night you arrived. I was angry at my father. I said what I said about your species to him, not to you. You refused to give me what I needed, which was an argument. I have not been able to stop thinking about that silence for 3 days." Daniel was looking at her now. He did not move. She did not move. Neither of them crossed the space between the 2 chairs. Her green, which had been pale since they had started speaking, deepened along her throat. It went past dark, past the color she had shown in the throne hall on the night of the insult, and it went almost to black along the hollow of her collarbones. She stood up. She did it quickly. She walked to the door of the observation deck. She stopped there with her hand on the frame. "Good night, Daniel," she said. It was the first time she had called him by his first name. "Good night, Kareth." She left. He sat at the reading desk for a long time after she was gone, and he watched the stars move, and he did not pick up the slate again that night. 3 days later, Tesser Prime appeared in the viewports, a colony of low stone towers and long white roads cut into the dust. The governor's welcome came in by communication laser, and it was perfect, from the diplomatic phrasing to the honor guard to the timing of the transport down to the surface. Daniel listened to the welcome from the back of the bridge, and something in him, the structural engineer's instinct that reads the shape of stress in a thing before the thing fails, told him that the welcome was too perfect. He went back to his quarters and pulled up the colony's transit records out of habit. 3 of the governor's personal guards had logged inbound traffic from a system that had no business being on the manifest. Daniel brought the manifest anomaly to Kareth before the honor guard boarded. She looked at it on his slate for a long minute. She was already in formal state dress, dark green over silver, hair braided in the royal style. Her expression did not change when she saw the transit log. She had grown up in a court where anomalies in manifests were often the first public sign of treason. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of the data. I do not know what it means." "It means," she said, "that I am being walked into something." She considered the problem for perhaps 3 breaths. Then she looked up. "We go down anyway." "All right. You stay beside me." "Yes. My guard does not know." "Agreed." She did not explain why her guard did not know. She did not have to. A princess from a court where manifests were altered by noble houses knew better than to trust an honor guard assembled at the colonial level. The manifest anomaly was not a rebel anomaly. The rebellion, if there was a rebellion, was not the threat. The threat was above the governor. They took the shuttle down at noon. The welcome was exactly what the diplomatic briefings had promised. An honor guard of 40 Vairani soldiers in full ceremonial plate. A governor in a long cream robe, smiling at the foot of the landing ramp. A banquet laid out in the colony's great stone hall, prepared that morning by a cook who had flown in from the capital for the occasion. 200 guests drawn from the colony's minor nobility and the mining guilds and 3 visiting trade delegations. Daniel stood at Kareth's right shoulder, in a dark ambassador's robe that had been tailored for him during the voyage, and he watched the hall. He saw the exits. He saw the 4 men along the east wall who were not servants and did not move the way servants moved. He saw the ceremonial brazier at the end of the high table, which was taller than the braziers in the capital and filled with coals that had been arranged too carefully. The governor gave a speech that said nothing. Daniel was watching the brazier when the charge went off. It went off exactly when the governor reached the part of his speech where a toast would have been called, which was exactly the moment when a noble audience's attention would be at the governor and not at the room. Daniel had already been moving. He had his hand on Kareth's arm before the sound of the blast reached the walls, and he pulled her down behind the overturned stone of the high table as the first shock wave rolled through the hall. The banquet hall dissolved into smoke and screaming. Daniel heard the 4 men along the east wall open up with pulse weapons. They were not firing wild. They were firing at one target. The target was Kareth. He pulled her further down behind the heavy stone of the high table, and he looked at the hall the way he looked at a building in collapse. He read the airflow from the shattered braziers. He read the pressure drop across the broken ceremonial windows. He read the stonework above them and saw that the east wall would hold. The north wall had already cracked, and the service corridor behind the high table led to the kitchens, which led to a maintenance shaft, which led down. "With me," he said. She went with him. They moved fast. Kareth was already bleeding from the shoulder, a clean wound where a pulse bolt had grazed her along the collarbone before Daniel had pulled her down. She was ignoring it. They crossed the kitchens at a flat sprint. 2 of the 4 gunmen were following them. Daniel took down one of them with a stone pestle off a counter, low across the shin and then across the throat, which surprised both Daniel and the gunman. The second gunman got a round off. It missed them. Daniel reached the maintenance shaft and got the panel open with a tool he should not have been carrying at a formal banquet and did not explain. And they went down. They went down 2 levels. They came out in the old city. Tesser Prime had been built on top of an older settlement. Not ruins, foundations. Long vaulted tunnels of dark stone that had been cut by some earlier colonial generation and abandoned when the new city was built over them. The tunnels were cool. They smelled of old water and dust. They were not on any current map. Daniel pulled her into a side chamber and eased her down against a stone wall and looked at her shoulder. "Let me see." "It's not deep. Let me see." She let him see. It was not deep. It was clean. A pulse bolt through the soft tissue along the top of her shoulder, cauterized by the weapon's own heat on the way through. It would need a proper clamp and a dressing before blood loss became a concern, but she was not going to die of it. He had field-set wounds like this before. He took the metal token out of his pocket, the piece of his sister's orbital, the one he had carried for 12 years and used once, 3 weeks before, on the brackets in the third ordeal. He tore a strip off his own sleeve. He used the token as a brace along the edge of the wound and wrapped the sleeve around it tight enough to close the bleed. Kareth watched him the whole time. She did not flinch. When he was done, she spoke. "Do you regret it?" she said. "Winning." He looked at her. His hands were still on her shoulder. "I regret," he said, "that you had to lose." Above them, in the tunnels, they could hear the gunmen searching. Voices, footsteps. The tunnels carried sound the way an old cistern carries sound, long and low and distorted, and Daniel and Kareth held very still against the stone wall and listened. 2 of the voices were not gunmen. They were higher up the chain. They were the voices of the men who had ordered the strike. Daniel could tell by the way the gunmen responded to them. Kareth could tell by the speech patterns. She recognized both voices before Daniel did. "Tesser," she said quietly, "and Ion." Daniel nodded. "Both houses," she said. "My father's oldest opposition. The colony's rebellion," Daniel said, "was a fiction. To bring me here. To kill me in a place where it could be blamed on the locals." They listened for a while longer. The voices moved away. The gunmen moved with them. Kareth looked at the wall across from them. She was thinking. We need to get word to the Imperial fleet, she said. If I die on this colony without anyone in the capital knowing the real story, my father will blame the colonists. Tassar and Ion will make sure he does. Quran 7 all over again. A rebellion blamed on settlers who had nothing to do with it. 10 years of war afterward. The whole Imperium against the outer colonies. Yes, Daniel said. We cannot fight our way back to the shuttle. No. What can we do? Daniel thought for a moment. He thought about the manifest anomaly. He thought about the governor's inbound traffic. He thought about the fact that whoever had set up the strike had needed command-level communications from off-colony and had used in the logs a relay encryption he had cracked 3 years earlier on another posting for a man who had since been poisoned in another system. The colony's central comm relay, he said, uses the old Tellurian encryption. My old ambassador cracked it in the year before he died. I was his engineer. I have the key. Which means if we get to the relay, I can broadcast the conspirators' own orders across the Vayrani Imperial network. Every loyal ship in range hears it. Your father sees it. The court sees it. Tesser and Ione hear themselves. She looked at him. She took his hand. Not a performance. A decision. Lead, she said. He led. The relay tower stood at the northern edge of the colony, a narrow stone spire threaded with cabling older than most of the buildings around it. It had been built by the original colonial engineers, who had understood the value of putting their long-range comms above the wind line. And it had survived 3 generations of rebuilding because the colonists had never quite been able to do better. The conspirators knew the tower mattered. They had posted 8 men around the base of it. Daniel and Kareth came at it from beneath. The old city's tunnels ran under the tower. Daniel had seen the sketches in the governor's engineering logs during the voyage, because he had read the engineering logs on every colony they were scheduled to visit out of the same habit that had let him catch the manifest anomaly. He had not expected to use them. He used them now. They came up through a stone hatch in the tower's ground floor. The hatch had not been opened in 60 years, and it opened with a sound like a small animal dying. Daniel caught it before it could fall back, and Kareth stepped up through it first with the pulse sidearm she had taken off the gunman in the kitchens, and she covered the stairwell while Daniel climbed after her. They went up. The tower had a single interior stairwell, spiraling around an open shaft. 2 of the outside guards were inside the tower. Kareth put one of them down at the landing with a single shot through the throat, clean without announcement. Daniel took the other one with a wrench he had picked up in the maintenance shaft across the base of the skull, and the man dropped without a sound. On the communications floor, Daniel went to work. The relay was exactly as old as he had hoped. He cracked the local encryption in 40 seconds. He sent a query to the conspirators' command channel, and when the channel answered, he captured the answer, looped it, and broadcast the conspirators' own voices, their own timestamps, their own orders, across every military frequency the tower could reach. The broadcast went out in the clear. It would reach the Imperial fleet in 90 seconds. It would reach the capital in 2 hours. He stepped back from the console. It's done. Kareth was watching the stairwell. She did not look at him when she answered. How long? The fleet will be here in 12 minutes. Loyal cruisers in system first. The full response by nightfall. And the men below us? We'll hear the broadcast in about 30 seconds. They will know everything has changed. She nodded. She did not lower the sidearm. 30 seconds passed. Below them in the tower, they heard the guards realize. The voices of the men at the base broke into confusion and then into shouting. Somewhere in the chaos, a single voice, older, steadier, harder, cut through. Lord Tesser, Kareth said quietly, he came down to this colony himself. He wanted to be here when I died. The old man came up the stairs alone. Daniel could hear him climbing, measured footsteps. An old man in armor, climbing a stone stairwell without hurry, the way a man climbs when he knows the ending has been taken from him and he intends to meet it on his feet. Kareth recognized the cadence of the steps. She had known him since she was a child. He had held her at her mother's funeral. He came around the last turn of the stairwell with a pulse pistol in his hand and his other hand held open, palm forward in an old Vayrani gesture of parley. Daughter of Valen, he said, Lord of Tesser. The broadcast will not save you. By the time the fleet arrives, I will have you in a shuttle off this colony. No, Come with me, he said, and your human lives. Refuse, and he dies in front of you, and we negotiate the rest of it from a better position. Daniel was watching the old man's shoulders. He was watching the angle of the pistol. He read what was going to happen a half second before it happened. The way he read stress concentrations in a wall. Lord Tesser was not going to negotiate. Lord Tessar was going to kill the human first, because killing the human first was the only way to break the princess's composure and the only way to make the rest of the plan work. The shoulders had already decided. The pistol was already starting to turn. Daniel stepped between them. He did not do it heroically. He did it practically. The doorway from the communications room into the stairwell was narrow, and he had the better angle on it, and he was the one of the two of them that Lord Tessar was not yet pointing the pistol at. He stepped into the line of fire half a second before Tessar fired. The pulse bolt took him through the left side, low, under the ribs. He heard Kareth's sidearm fire 3 times before he hit the floor. Lord Tesser of the House of Tesser went down against the stone wall with 3 clean rounds through his chest, and his pistol clattered down the stairwell ahead of him, and he did not move again. Kareth was beside Daniel before Tessar had finished falling. Daniel, I'm alive. You're shot. I noticed. Hold still. I am. She had the field kit open. It had been in the pack she had taken off the first gunman in the kitchens, and she had been carrying it, and now she worked on him the way he had worked on her in the tunnels 2 hours earlier. She cauterized the entry. She checked the exit. She cut away his robe along the wound. Her hands were steady. Her green had gone very dark along her throat. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of the Imperial fleet, which she could already hear on approach. She was still working on him when the first Loyal Cruiser's medical team came up the tower stairwell. They flew them back to the Theodora. Daniel drifted in and out for the first day. The Imperial medics had stabilized him on the cruiser's deck within minutes of reaching him, and by the time he woke up properly, he was in a recovery bay aboard the Theodora with a bandage along his left side and an intravenous line in his arm. Kareth was sitting in a chair beside his bed. She had not changed out of the clothes she had worn on the colony. Her shoulder was freshly dressed. She had not slept. He looked at her. I'm alive, he said. I noticed. He closed his eyes. He opened them. How long? Almost a day. The conspiracy. Tessar is dead. Eon has been arrested. My father has called the Moon Court. The full political fallout will take months. The essential thing is done. He nodded. It hurt. She looked at her hands. She was gathering herself to say something. Daniel knew what it was before she said it. He let her say it anyway, because she needed to. When we return to the capital, she said, I am going to go before the Moon Court. I am going to ask for the oath to be dissolved. It will be granted. The old noblewoman who witnessed our wedding, her name is Celis Corin, and she has the authority. She will release me. She will release you. You will be free of me. I owe you that. I owe you more than that. It is what I have to give. She looked up at him. You do not need to answer now. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. He was tired. His side hurt. His hands felt far away. But he looked at her and he said what he had to say, because he had come too far with her to not say it. I'm not asking to be released, he said. I'm asking to be chosen. She did not answer for a long time. She was very still. Then she took his hand. She did not take it the way she had taken it in the tunnel beneath the colony. That had been a decision about what they were going to do. This was a decision about what they were going to be. She held his hand and she did not let go for a long time. On the balcony of the Imperial Palace, a week later, at dawn, they stood together and watched the capital wake in copper light. Neither of them spoke at first. The sun climbed over the eastern towers and caught the green canopy below them and held the color in the leaves the way it had held the color in the copper spires the night Daniel had first arrived, and the city began, as it did every morning, to move. Merchants opened the shutters along the lower avenues. The great bells at the Moon Court rang the first hour. Somewhere below the palace wall, a Vairani child laughed at something Daniel could not see, and the sound carried up the stone in the clean morning air. My father, Kareth said finally, approved it last night. The Moon Court has confirmed it. Celis Corin presided. The oath, reaffirmed, by choice this time, both of ours. Good. She turned and looked at him. You know what they called you, she said. In the court. On the night we met. I know. Short-lived. He smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in her presence. It surprised her. Yes, he said. They were wrong about a great many things, she said, but they were right about that one. You will not live as long as I will live. You will be old and gone before I am halfway through my life. I have thought about this for a week. I have tried to talk myself out of it. I cannot. Kareth, listen. He listened. If I have 50 years with you, she said, that is more than most of my people have in 500. And if I spend the rest of my years after that carrying you with me, then I will have carried something worth the wait. I am not a fool. I know what I am choosing. I am choosing it anyway. She put her hand flat against his chest, over the heart, the way her father had done in the chamber of the mercy gate on the day Daniel had won her without meaning to. He covered her hand with his own. They stood there for a while. The token was still in his pocket. He could feel it against his hip where it had sat for 12 years. He did not touch it. He did not need to today. Below them, the capital went about its morning. The sun climbed. A wind that smelled faintly of something spiced moved through the garden terraces, and somewhere down in the courtyard, a small flock of the long-necked green birds, the Vairani kept in their palace gardens, took flight in a single rising turn, and the two of them stood on the balcony and watched the birds go up, and they did not speak again for a long time.